I grew up in Ohio in the 70s. My childhood friend Joe and I were outside all the time. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty large forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would pretty much play in the woods all weekend. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that came out around the same time. The idea was that we would walk on the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find a bridge to fish from, and maybe set up camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, and we would likely be trespassing on somebody else's property, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun on our journey. We did locate the river, and discovered old bridges that nobody seemed to go to, and did some fishing. At night we camped in the woods near the tracks, and would build small campfires. Nothing crazy ever happened. It was ideal. In fact, it was so much fun that we did this multiple times, and we never had a problem. After graduation, Joe and I went our own ways. We both left our hometown, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits. One summer in the mid-90s, we both happened to be in our hometown for about a week. We spent some time with our families in the day, and at night, we would either stop at the local bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, Joe and I got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer is one hell of a mix. It was decided that we would take a day before we left, walk on the tracks, and maybe camp out in the woods for one night. The day came, and we set out in the morning. We had my wife drop us off at our old starting point, just outside of our hometown. She thought we were absolutely nuts, and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, that we would go in the opposite direction, just to change things up. We knew the surroundings pretty well, and we had a map. So I said, "What the hell? Why not?" And we set off. The day went fine. It was fun, and a bit sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, talked, before moving on. We had no fishing gear this time around, but we did bring some canned food and other stuff. Before it got dark, we picked a spot to set up camp. It was a thick, forested area. Trees bordered the train tracks, so we felt like we were in a tunnel. We had brought some small hammocks to sleep in, but before we could set them up, we decided to do a bit of scouting on the perimeter. This is what we used to do back in the old days. We would walk around the area for a bit just to make sure we weren't intruding on somebody's property. We walked for maybe 100 feet or so into the woods, and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything at the top of this short hill, that we would be fine. However, when we reached the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do next. We both assumed it was just a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear path to it. From where we were, it did not look like it was occupied. No movement could be seen, and no lights. We decided to move a bit closer, just to be sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack. It appeared to be an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The building was sagging, with wooden planks nearly black from all the years of moss and rot. A crucifix still stood at the top of the place, and was also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just an open doorway. We got close enough to see inside. There were still those rows of benches and a built-up section near the back, where the preacher stood. We didn't go all the way in, nor did we want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else, No footprints, no pathways leading to this place, no nearby roads. It was just an abandoned church sitting in the middle of the woods. We quickly left and climbed back up the hill to the spot we had chosen to camp at. Having the hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a bit creeped out. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing an abandoned building sitting in the middle of the forest. Besides, at this point it was near dusk, and we had hung up our hammocks and were ready to go to sleep and would be moving on early the next morning. Night fell, and as we lay in our hammocks, making small talk, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went something like this. Did you hear that? Yeah. What the hell was it? It sounds like people singing. That was what I said at the time, but it didn't actually sound like singing. We both got out of our hammocks and hunkered down, and carefully listened for the next minute or two. The singing continued. Finally, it was decided that we would creep back down the hill and see if we could spot where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in these woods. It was second nature to us at this point. The moon was barely visible and provided just enough light so you can make your way through the trees. But truth be told, in certain spots, it was almost pitch black. For obvious reasons, we did not use our flashlights as we slowly crept up the hill. As we made our way up the hill, we didn't chatter. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from that old church, and the strange noise was resonating from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a very hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light that we saw appeared to be coming from candles by the way it flickered, and though we tried, we could not make out what was being sung, rather chanted. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see what was taking place inside, having absolutely no intentions of getting any closer. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit longer, and then suddenly stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant.
Sois los corderos de un Dios inexistente creado por el hombre. Gozad hasta saciaros de este sagrado banquete.
This voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies. But again, he was speaking in a different language. I couldn't understand a single word he said. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song.
Ahora estás aquí en este lugar, porque la grandeza de la mano de Dios quiso que así fuera tu destino. Nosotros somos tu sangre. Eres el rey de la codicia. Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir. ¿Te horroriza lo que ves? Más que a ti mismo. ¿Es por lo sobrenatural de nuestro ser? ¿O por el futuro que estás a punto de emprender? Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir.
This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wailing. That just kept getting louder and louder. It got so loud and disturbing that I had to cover my ears until it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say that we needed to get the hell out of here, when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "Look, they're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them all out, but we did see a line of figures walking out of the open doorway. All of them were holding hands single file. We could see that they had flashlights. They were beginning to sing again as the flashlight beams began moving toward the hill. Toward us. We booked it back to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once we were there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. To our horror, we saw the lights moving down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was running. We continued to run in short bursts and walked fast as we catched our breaths, and we eventually stopped seeing the lights. According to our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes away from here. We walked down the road and got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come pick us up. My wife and other friends that I have told this story to think that it was probably just kids messing around. But I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not entirely sure who those people were, but this was definitely the creepiest experience that has ever happened to me out in those woods. Near where I live, there is a glorified gravel path through some woods called Rube Hill. It runs for about 3 miles. Only half a mile of it is paved. On the south end is pavement, with a few old but otherwise normal houses dotting it. Deceptively average at that point. Then the houses end, along with the pavement, and the gravel road shoots up a steep hill. It's not taken care of at all. So unless you're driving an off-road vehicle, you would want to be very careful. So since you would need to drive slowly, you would get a nice clear view of the homemade signs nailed to the trees with messages like, "No trespassing," and "We are watching you," scrawled with a permanent marker. At the top of the hill, the road winds lazily for almost a mile, before driving back down the other side of the hill. The gravel is in equally poor condition on the other side as well. Once you reach the bottom, the road cuts straightish for about a mile through cornfields before intersecting with another road. The reason I'm so familiar with the layout is that I have often taken friends on late-night drives to this road just to scare the crap out of them. It was never much of an elaborate prank. I would just slowly drive up the hill and play creepy music to get them amped up and paranoid. I always made sure to bring up the meth heads and their nearby labs, and how the sheriffs try to avoid going here because it's dangerous. These are things that I've heard before as well. I figured it was all bullshit, just made up stories, but now I think there's an element of truth to some of these rumors. One night I was with my friend Aaron, and we decided to go on a late-night drive to Rube Hill, just to freak ourselves out. So we took off, drove down the various country highways and back roads, and turned onto it, and eventually reached our destination. I made sure to play extra creepy music. Since Aaron and I had made this trip several times before, it honestly lost all of its creepy luster on me by then. But I still enjoyed these long drives and scaring my friends. We were almost across the hill, about to make our descent down the other side, when Aaron freaked out. I checked my mirrors to see what he was shitting his fist over, and saw the headlights of a truck. The truck was under the only street light on top of the hill. It was a really dim orange light, and I could see that it was kicking up a ton of dirt as it was speeding towards us. I paused the music, and sure enough, with the windows down, I could hear the gravel crunching and flying as the vehicle accelerated. Keep in mind that I have driven down this road many times, both day and night, and in all this time I have never encountered another vehicle. So seeing this truck tearing down the road, trying to catch up to us at midnight, was pretty jarring. Usually I didn't relinquish my brakes driving down that hill, but this time, I didn't even touch them. So, the following night, I'm hanging out with another friend of mine, Chris. We were just lounging about, playing video games, talking about quantum physics, Chris's favorite topic, and Chipotle, my favorite topic. I of course told him all about Aaron and I getting chased the previous night. I kinda hammed it up a bit, and made it come across a bit more harrowing than it actually was. But now Chris wanted to go down the road. We waited until late at night, I would say around 2 a.m., before we set out to Rube Hill. This time, I wasn't going to play my music. I wanted to be alert. Things were going normal at first, then I slammed on my brakes. I put the car in park and said, "You see that too, right?" I looked at Chris. He was just as confused as I was, and just nodded. My headlights were clearly illuminating a thick metal cable stretched across the road. On the right, it was wrapped around a tree, at what I'd guess was roughly head height for a standing adult. The other end was anchored to a fence across the road, at roughly chest height. I had no idea what to make of this or how to react. That's when I heard gravel being thrown by tires. I checked my mirrors, and sure enough, truck headlights were hauling ass down the road behind us. I began to freak out. My breathing and heart rate were out of control, and I broke out in a sweat. Chris just swore under his breath quietly. I put the car into drive and pulled as far to the right as I possibly could, and my low-sitting car was able to slide under the cable with a loud metal-on-metal scraping noise. I cringed as I heard the scrape, but I wasn't about to sit there and get deliveranced. So again, I flew down the hill. And this is the creepy cherry on the sundae, for me personally, because Chris didn't see it. As we entered the cornfields, I glanced to my right and briefly caught a glimpse of somebody standing about 3 or 4 feet back in the corn. I just felt my stomach scrunch up and floored the accelerator. I then glanced into my rearview mirror, and I could see the man now standing on the road behind us, illuminated by the moonlight. He had a long object slung over his shoulder. I couldn't tell if it was a cane, or perhaps a rifle, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. By the time I told Chris about it, we were already around the bend and out of sight. I haven't been back there since that night. There is a hiking trail near my school. It's about 2 miles to the top, with a wonderful view of the entire valley. My friends and I like to go there from time to time, whenever we got bored. One Saturday evening, we set off. The sun was beginning to set, right as we started the 2-mile walk through the forest. It was terrible timing, but we all knew this trail. Everything started off normal, but I began to get creeped out as it continued getting darker. I'm a paranoid person by nature, and that didn't help matters when suddenly one of our group says, "What's that?" I don't have the best eyesight, and I couldn't really see what they were referring to. "I think it's a girl," another friend said. By this point, I was thoroughly freaked out. It was 9 p.m. on a dark hiking trail. It was the kind of setting straight out of a slasher film. We moved closer, and my eyes eventually adjusted enough to the darkness. There was a young woman sitting on a pile of leaves, with her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, wearing only a dirty pink nightgown. She did not acknowledge us. "Should we go try to help her? I don't know," It looks like she's having a bad trip. My friend gave me these mushrooms one time and Would you guys shut up? I think she has a knife. I strained my eyes to see, but she did appear to be cradling a knife in her lap. Oh, fuck this. I'm out of here. Most of our group were now thoroughly frightened. We picked up our pace and headed back downhill, constantly checking our phones, but of course, there was no signal. I think you guys are being a bit dramatic. That girl back there was just having a bad trip. Oh, and I suppose that she brought that knife along just to pick out the dirt in her fingernails. You're an idiot. I'm just saying that she might not be a danger. Shut up. Someone's coming. We soon encounter a man, frantically running up the trail. Excuse me, have any of you seen my daughter? At the time, my paranoia got the best of me. I was thinking that we might have seen somebody who had escaped her kidnapper. The girl we saw had to be at least in her early 20s. She was not a child or a teenager. No, we haven't seen anyone out here. The man then took off and disappeared down the trail. As you can guess, we all ran the rest of the way back. Unfortunately, the cell service didn't return until we got back into the car, but we did call and report what we saw to the police as soon as we could. They searched the area, but we never heard any kind of update. I don't know what was happening in those woods that night, but I hope that girl got some help, and that man we encountered was just a concerned father.
There's always a reason to be afraid.